if you get married today, is not just a possibility, but a probability that you'll be divorced. Probability is anything over 50%. It's probable you'll be divorced because the divorce rate is over 50% in the United States. So the odds are against you. You have to work hard to beat the odds in a happy marriage to prevent divorce. Okay, so the question is, if this is so common, such a disaster for our society today, 1 out of 2 marriages ending in divorce, what's the cause of this? Now, you know that from University of Minnesota, that's when they made this study there, sponsored by the Billy Graham Association, and that sociological study, they had an interesting factor there about spirituality, which is the second cause of divorce. Lack of spiritual. The first cause is lack of emotional maturity. The second cause is lack of spiritual maturity, according to these psychiatrists. Go ahead, just jump a second. Let me jump ahead a second to the second cause of breakdown in marriage: spiritual maturity. In this study at the University of Minnesota, they found out that our typical divorce rate of 1 out of 2 marriages ending in divorce will be lowered to 1 out of 500 marriages in divorce in any family in which there's Bible reading in the family every day or family prayer. It drops from 1 out of 2 to 1 out of 500 in any family that has family prayer or family Bible reading together. That's amazing, huh? What God has joined together. We don't ask God to keep it together. Let no man put us under. Okay, going back to the first cause, it was amazing that these psychiatrists, who were not theologians, they said the first cause of breakdown in marriage is emotional immaturity. The second cause of breakdown in marriage is spiritual immaturity. It's interesting they talk about spiritual immaturity, but they said it's very important to have spiritual ideals if you want to have a successful marriage. And no one can have a very happy marriage without spiritual ideals on both parts, husband and wife. There has to be spiritual compatibility, far more important than political compatibility and perhaps even physical compatibility. It's important to have that spiritual compatibility. But anyway, and that's why Paul says, be not unequally yoked. You know, if you marry an agnostic or an atheist or maybe even non-Christian of some kind, you're going to have a much higher divorce rate, of course, much, much higher. Every religion knows that. The Lutherans say, you marry Lutherans. The Presbyterians say, if you're a Presbyterian, marry a Presbyterian. The Catholics say, if you're a Catholic, marry a Catholic. They say the more compatibility you have religious-wise, the stronger your protection against divorce. But again, that's the secondary thing. That's the spiritual factor. Let's go back to the psychological factor. They asked me the question in this panel discussion, if the major cause is psychological immaturity that causes breakdown in marriage, affecting communication and everything, how do you know if you're psychologically immature? Or in the old phraseology, how do you know if you're neurotic? How do you know that? How do you measure that? So when they asked me this question, I said, you know, there are as many definitions of neurosis as there are psychiatrists and psychologists. You can give all kinds of characteristics like insecurity, a feeling of incompetence, a feeling of anxiety, a feeling of worthlessness. There's all kinds of symptoms or combination of symptoms called syndromes that could indicate a neurotic personality. So I said, maybe one of the other speakers here would like to field that question. So Victor was there, and he said, I'll field it. And ever since then, I've been called this Victor analogy. He says, think of yourself as a teeter-totter or seesaw on a fulcrum, you know, a child's playground seesaw, and have weights on either end. So if more weight on this end, it goes down. More weight on this end, this goes down, that goes up. Okay? One end goes down, the other end goes up. Now he says, everyone needs 2 things to be happy in life. They need, first, the ability to give love abundantly, and second, the ability to receive love abundantly. Giving and receiving love. 2 things are needed, not one, both. Both are needed. Now, here's the criterion, the rule of thumb to know if you're neurotic. If you have a greater need to receive love than a need to give love, then you are neurotic. If you have a greater need to give love than to receive love, then you're a well-integrated personality. Not whether you do it or not, it's whether you have the need to do it. Huh? If you have a greater need to receive love than to give love, then you are neurotic. Now that's a pretty workable criterion. It may have to be qualified a little bit here and there, but anyway, it's a pretty workable. We apply this now to marriage. We were talking about marriage at that time. Marriage is certainly one major kind of love, certainly not the only kind, but 90% of our adult population are married, and not many have voluntary or involuntary celibacy. So let's take that big segment of 90% of our population in marriage. According to Alan Kavanaugh, Kavanaugh especially, I think, is, in my mind, I think the greatest love specialist in psychology, along with Biscaglia, but I think he's better than Biscaglia for scientizing anyway, of love. He, with Alan, had a scale of 5 types of marriages. There is, first of all, the marriage that God designed called the very happy marriage. That's the top rung of the ladder, very happy marriage. Now, a long step below that, way below the very happy marriage, is a second type called the happy marriage. Not very happy, but happy. A happy marriage. It's far below the very happy marriage, though. There's a great difference between those two. And you go down another step, a big step below the happy marriage, you get the satisfactory marriage. We're getting along. We won't get divorced. We're all right. I'm happy with them. We're satisfied. That is mediocre or satisfactory marriage. Anyone in that state is out of God's will already, just by being it. That's not God's will. If you have a satisfactory marriage, you should be ashamed of yourself. You know, 1 out of every 4 divorces occurs after 20 years of marriage. And most of those late divorces occur in the satisfactory marriages. They never think they're going to be in a divorce court, but it happens eventually. And that accounts for 1/4 of all our divorces. People that coast along without building, as Eric Fromm writes in his book, The Art of Loving, they don't exercise their love. If you don't exercise a muscle, it atrophies. If you don't exercise love, it will atrophy too. Just like if you don't never walk, you're never going to be able to walk pretty soon. You're going to be practically paralyzed. You'll be limping along and shuffling along without having any kind of ability to move freely with limberness. You need ongoing exercise and ongoing muscular activity. For physical things, you need also ongoing exercise of love. That's a major principle of Eric Fromm. So that's the third level, the third rung. But if you're in that third rung of a satisfactory marriage, consider yourself out of the will of God. God doesn't want that for you. And you're in danger, really in great danger, of late divorce. Now, if you go down way below the satisfactory marriage to the 4th level, you have the unhappy marriage. That's far below the satisfactory. That's unhappy marriage. Now, if you go to the 5th level, that's the very unhappy marriage. Okay? Now, you put all these marriages together, the last 3, anything less than happy. Put the last 3 together, and you have 65 to 75% of all marriages in the United States, if you use the very strict criteria proposed by Alan Kavanaugh. Now, I jump to the top level, the very happy marriage, and giving my retreats. I give weekend retreats sometimes on marriage, and sometimes I'll spend the whole weekend, 3 days, talking about nothing but the characteristics of a very happy marriage. You know, using all of the various types, like the peak experience. What is a peak experience? How does one know? That St. Thomas Aquinas speaks about that in the 13th century, the so-called amicitia perfecta, perfect friendship. What is a perfect friendship? And what is this peak experience? How does it operate now? When we talk about all these characteristics of marriage, for 3 days, nothing but that description. At the end of the retreats, married couples retreats, people come to me and say, we came to this retreat, we thought we had a very happy marriage till we came to this damn retreat. Now that shows something. It shows that they didn't know their own immaturity. When you go back to Kavanaugh, and he says, now this is scary. He says, 99 people out of 100 do not know how to love maturely. Only 1% know how to love maturely. So if we have 100 people here, there's only one person here that knows how to love maturely. Is this a cross-section of our society? There'd be only one person in this crowd that knows how to love maturely. He says only 15% know how to love adequately. Now, he's got pretty strict criteria, but he says only 15% know how to love adequately. Only 1% knows how to love maturely. No wonder we have a high divorce rate. Eh? But the arrogance of people who say, oh, I'm a great lover. I know all about love. They've never even taken a course in psychology, never made any marriage preparation course. They know nothing about child psychology. They launch into a whole lifetime of raising children and trying to cultivate marriage, not knowing the first thing about it, just following the basic instincts in our tumultuous society where so many things are militating against happy marriage and love and so on. So much infidelity and so much mediocrity and so much selfishness and so on, and they're trying to cope with this on the basis of their own arrogance, thinking they know how to love, and they don't have the capacity to love. So now, if you take the last 3 of those 5 levels, let's say you get 65 to 75% of adults, married adults in the United States fit into something less than a happy marriage. We're using strict criteria, remember though. If you go to the top of the ladder, the very happy marriage, it's only 1 marriage out of 150 that fits that category of a very happy marriage. 1 out of 150. Because you need 2 people, not 1, 2 people who are both greatly emotionally mature, who are integrated, really integrated, and at the same time are spiritually mature. If one is relatively mature and the other is not, you're off balance. That's not enough. First of all, if you marry an immature person who shows immaturity on your part, you haven't had the perspicacity to see they're immature. And so you see, people don't even ask themselves, say, I love you and you love me, let's get together and get married. They don't say, what's this going to be like living with this person 10, 15, 25 years from now? They can't project, and that itself shows lack of maturity. They can't see behavior patterns and extrapolate how they might be in the years to come. It takes a great deal of looking at a person and getting the feel of a person and knowing the reliability of a person and all those characteristics. And so people jump into marriage like they're just going for a quick swim or something. Jump in the pool. Anyway, so we have a disastrous situation here. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving all the characteristics of a very happy marriage and the peak experience and all that sort of thing, because we deal with that in 18 hours of marriage tapes. And so if you want to specialize in that, you can check with that. I just want to deal with this problem from the point of the healing of memories. I want you to be checking your target area, as we call it, to see how you fit in all these patterns we're talking about. How would you diagnose yourself if you're really objective? How happy do you feel in your marriage and in your relationship with others and so on? What is your social relationship? What degree of comfort do you have in interpersonal relationships? Feedback. So these are areas that you want to keep in the back of your mind as target areas for the prayer for healing, what needs to be healed. A person may not be neurotic. Of course, we're presuming no one here is psychotic, which is insanity. Yeah. I mean, that would be very serious forms of emotional problems like schizophrenia, hebephrenia, catatonia, paranoia, and so on. But there may be some who have some really, and in the 10 forms of neurotic conditions, and those are what we're dealing with here. Or there may be some who are subneurotic, that are below a real neurotic stage. We call those persons with hang-ups. They may have an extraordinary fear of snakes or fear of high places or something like that, or panic states or something. And these are emotional problems like inhibitions in communications, where they can't communicate with facility and comfort. They cannot have tender-hearted love with ease. That's a mental sickness that often is not categorized as neurosis, but yet it's a real sickness that needs to be healed. So that should be part of your target area if you are I hope you're making your target area for the prayer for tomorrow. Incidentally, the studies in Vanderbilt University dealing with the outlook of life in general, they find that persons who, because of love, have a feeling of real purpose in life. They really know what life's all about. They really know where they're going. And they move step by step with a real sense of progression. They don't backslide. They don't collapse in depression as they think about the hurts of the past. They just move right along. Kind of this new Japanese psychology called constructive living. It's a magnificent program of persons that deal with their negative feelings by simply using the will to overcome that. They say, I refuse to let myself be handicapped by the problems of the past. I'm going to move on. I was trying to practice that when I had this severe stuttering, and people looked at me as if I were retarded. And I lost my scholarships, and the kids laughing at me when I preach and all. And I just got to just block that out and disregard this completely and go ahead and stutter and keep preaching and keep making a fool of myself and just be a fool for Christ. And I kept trying to, just charge through it with willpower and let the chips fall where they may and not try to intercept all these things to myself. When I found that this had been scientized in the Japanese philosophy of the constructive living thing, I was happy that it had been, because I didn't have a scientized form. I just had my own little Hampsch-Healing psychology. Anyway, those people that do that have this ability to live constructively and build on themselves in spite of all their handicaps and hurts and so on, and take steps. Get rid of the guilt by repentance. Get rid of the hurts by forgiveness. Get rid of all the spiritual ineptitudes by turning. They welcome death the way St. Paul did when he said, I desire to be dissolved and to be with Christ. For them, death is a fulfillment, not an escapism. Suicide is escapism. But the desire to die, to get to your eternity, your real life that Paul had, that is fulfillment. The persons who have a good attitude toward life and a purpose in life will not be afraid of death for that reason, not for suicidal reasons. For that reason, fulfillment reasons, they will be much better equipped for death. So if a person has a fear of death, a morbid fear of death, that shows there is already a mental problem, an emotional problem. Their attitude, their life attitude is wrong, so their death attitude is going to be wrong. After all, death is a beautiful experience. As it says in the Epistle of Hebrews, it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of a living God, but that's for sinners who die unrepentant. But it's a beautiful thing to fall into the arms of a loving God. And so when you look forward to just simply going to your real home, you're not afraid of death at all. And not only that, but bereavement itself, the death of your loved ones is not so poignant. You'll have the so-called biological mourning experience, as Jesus did when he wept over the tomb of Lazarus. Even though he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he still, wept. Behold how he loved him. He had a mourning experience. And that's okay, and that's good. It's very important, especially to prevent subsequent psychosomatic effects like headaches and things like that, to get through that, go through the mourning process. But you will have a much better attitude toward the death of others, your loved ones, when you lose them, because you know you're not losing them. You know, for instance, that your beloved dead who are with the Lord are loving you far more intimately, far more intensely than they ever did during life. Far more intensely. They're far more understanding, far more forgiving, because they're loving you through the heart of God. It's a total experience. And they're not up there someplace. They are very close to you because they are where God is, in a sense. Maybe in heaven, in a sense, but they're very close to you because their love is channeled to you through the heart of God. So you're never far from your beloved dead. So you don't feel a loss, so much of a loss, at least not a morbid experience of long, hard to get over with bereavement. For a Christian with the right concept of that, it's a very beautiful thing. So here you have love operating in a good, wholesome way, as distinguished from love operating in a morbid way, a selfish kind of love. For instance, people that grieve so long about their deceased husbands and their wives and children, and they go on and on, life is never the same for them. They really haven't grown up, and what they do is really the practicing self-pity. They don't really care about the happiness of their loved ones as much as they care about their own loneliness. And so they think of the negative, poor little me, rather than, isn't it great that my beloved is with the Lord? They think negatively rather than positively. They're sick. They're mentally, emotionally sick. But they're also unchristian in a sense. They really haven't got the Christian attitude of good, wholesome bereavement. You go through it and get it over with and get on with life and rejoice that your beloved are with the Lord. And they're waiting there, eagerly, happily waiting to receive you with them in the Lord, and you're eagerly waiting to be with them in the Lord too. So it's always, just a transition. They've gone out of town for a while. That's all. That's a good, healthy attitude, huh? Okay. I have a lot of things that have to do with inability to deal with stress. Some of the things they're finding that during the second trimester of pregnancy, how women under stress can cause hormonal reactions that may affect the DNA in the child, especially the first and second, mostly the second trimester of pregnancy, and could produce a tendency toward homosexuality in males. It doesn't cause that in females. There's other causes. Of course, there's there's 6 types of male homosexuality and probably 8 types of female, so there's different genetic structures that have to deal with different types. Let's go back to this idea of love a little bit in terms of hostility and anger that is the eclipsing of love, and the feeling of loneliness and unworthiness and guilt that's the eclipsing of self-love. Again, those 2 antinomastic emotions. Now, see what they do to shorten our lives. In our convention in Hawaii, the psychiatric convention, the theme was, how can you extend your life by using your mind? And the conclusion was that one could add on the average about 15 years to your life if you completely controlled feelings of loneliness and feelings of repressed anger, hostility. In other words, if you learn to give and receive love. You receive love, you couldn't be lonely. You might be alone, but you're never lonely if you receive love. There's a great difference between being alone and being lonely. People who are lonely can be lonely in a crowd because they're not receiving love. So to receive love and to give love, again, we got that double dimension of the human dynamic here. The 2 weights on the teeter-totter, the seesaw. The anger is not loving. When you're angry at someone, there's hostility. You're not giving love, not forgiving, so you're not giving love. The persons that overcome these 2 things, they agreed could live possibly as much as 15 years longer. They checked old people who lived to be very, very old in old folks' homes and so on. The ones that really were long-lived, aside from having good genes, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, if you want to live a long life, choose long-lived ancestors. But if you, aside from the genetic factor, we're talking about the environmental and the mental attitude factors that could contribute to longevity. These people that lived very long were persons who, once they lost a loved one, immediately established new relationships, got new friends, and kept maintaining good friendship and warmth. It goes back to all those things we talked about last night, the studies in Alameda, California, and the 7,000 people they studied and how they had tenfold range of arthritis when they didn't get the love and the security, the warm family life and all that, the good marriage. So it's the same thing here. You can extend your life. And the mortality rate is much higher among the unloved. It's much higher among divorced. And among widows, unless they learn to accommodate, the widows and divorced and separated people, if they accommodate to their situation and don't just grieve over their loneliness and keep good warm relationship with others, they survive as well as people who are married. In one of our trips to Israel, I took a tour through that famous Beth Hospital. I can't think of the name of that big hospital up on the hill there outside of Jerusalem. It's world famous. There's so many Jewish doctors, they don't know what to do with themselves, so they go into research. And they're researching up there. And one of the things they researched was persons who were unhappily married versus was happily married. They dealt with 10,000 Israeli men. And they asked them a simple question, are you happily married or unhappily married? That was the only question. They separated the 2 groups. And they found out that not only the death rate was higher, the sickness rate was much higher. All kinds of diseases and sickness, especially cardiovascular problems and tendency toward cancer, those 2 things are much higher in the men who are unhappily married than those who are happily married. So life can be extended by our attitudes. There's no question about that. I'm in the process of writing an article on that point right now for another booklet. But now, the love, of course, is an antidote. Giving love to those you are angry against, the repressed anger, or receiving love to remove the loneliness, okay? The sense of nobody loves me, I'm unworthy of love, I'm a failure, I'm not attractive, I'm overweight, I'm ugly, I'm this, I'm that. Keep downplaying yourself and maybe exaggerating the downplay is caused by other people who have been negative to you in your past. And you tend to look at that under a magnifying glass because you always look at your worst self. There's a technical word for that. It's a sesquipedalianistic phraseology. I can't remember what it is right now, but anyway. The power of love. Love is the antidote to that. Love is the antidote to that. Dr. Lynch, you've seen him on TV, The Donahue Show and so on. He's a famous psychosomatic clinic leader in the University of Maryland. Talks about the power of love, and he says the same thing. Benjamin Spock, in dealing with children, also has some interesting things to say. But the one that impressed me was Emery Breitner, who was a psychiatrist from the what was formerly New York's Long Island Jewish Hillside Medical Center, famous medical center there. He says, why do some people radiate good health while others just constantly look like they just got out of a sick bed? People go through their whole life somehow just dragging themselves around, you know? They're not vigorously exercising, and they're full of zest and smiling and happy, and they're just dragging themselves through life. A lot of real blah, deadbeat personalities. Huh? What makes the difference between these two types of people? Breitner asks. And he studied these people and their behavior patterns and things and says, the whole answer is love. The ones who have a spring in their step and the ones that are alive and vibrant, even when they have medical problems perhaps, they still are full of vitality and a zest for living because they have received love and they give love. And if they haven't received enough love, they still give love and then they receive it. Because the most lovable person in the world are the most loving persons in the world. So he says, give and receive love. It's interesting that his studies coincide exactly with all these other findings in Scripture itself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Give love, give love, give love. And you receive love. So now the people who express love for others, they did an interesting study in California, the Office of Prevention in the California Department of Mental Health. They got one section just for prevention of mental health problems there in California. And they took 1,000 people and studied them in this particular survey, and they put it on a computer, and they had a score for health. What constitutes good health? You know, they checked the blood pressure, and they checked this, and they checked that, and the cholesterol, and vitality, and the utilization of oxygen, and exercise, and the mental response to lights, and all this sort of thing. They took all these measurements, and they put it on a computer, and they got a score. If you have 100, you got perfect health. If you got 0, you got no health. You're dead. You know, and so then they took all these people, 1,000 people in the experiment, and they found out. They said the ones that they scored everyone, and when they found that the one element that made the great difference, increasing the score by 50%, was the element of love. Those who felt loved by others and who also loved others had twice the mathematical score of health than those who didn't. So let's say the non-healthy persons had, say, 25%. The healthy person would have 75%. Or 50%, you know. It would be twice as high in that one component of giving and receiving love. Now, put that in the context of Scripture for a moment. 1 John 4:16. Well, start with 4:8, and then he expounds the same concept in verse 16. God is love. It doesn't say God has love. God is love. Personified love. That requires a good theological explanation, by the way, but anyway. Because the Holy Spirit is a personified love that exists mutually between the Father and the Son. It's a crossfire of love between the Father and the Son. By the way, when you're baptized in the Spirit, you're immersed in this crossfire of love between the Father and the Son that is the Holy Spirit. That's what it means to be baptized in the Spirit. Which is why, as Paul says, his love abounds in us by his Spirit abounding within us in Romans 8. Anyway, look at this. God is love. Now look at verse 16. God is love, and he who abides in love, that could be marital love, anything. He who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. Now you've got to exclude false love, incestuous love, adulterous love, fornicative love, egocentric love, any kind of perverse love, perversion, any kind of love that exclude. Take the authentic love with the characteristics of authentic love, where you love the soul of the person as well as the body. I don't say I love you and you love me, and even though this is adultery, I'll push you into hell and you push me into hell, and we'll call it love. This is that's not love. You love the body, but you don't love the soul. So what it is lust, really. But anyway, where you have authentic love, you have God. So a person who is loving is enveloped in God's love, and not only enveloped, but permeated, is penetrated with God's love. That's what the word abide in, huh? God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. So you've got mutuality there. Now here you have spiritual health, not just physical health, not just emotional health. So, when you bring this down to the bottom line, it's really one 4-letter word. Love. That's the answer. Huh? interesting that in most languages, most modern languages, the word for God is a four-letter word too. As love is a four-letter word. God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. Okay, now let's talk about this. We talked a little bit about the epigenesis of love, the developmental process of love. Now I want to go back to that through the pregnancy. If you knew what kind of a person that your mother was, you're going to find out something about yourself now. And especially if you know how she might have been during her pregnancy, you'll find out something about yourself for your target area. But remember, I'm warning you now, as I go into what I'm saying, those of you women, and some of you men that deal with this indirectly also with the father's influence, those of you women who have had children, you may go the other direction. Remember, I said you may look up and have resentment toward your parents who damaged you, and look down toward your kids and have guilt for damaging them. You know, the resentment and the guilt, the two directions. Watch out for that again now as we go to this. So I'm just warning you, if you get shattered, it means you aren't paying attention to what I said. You're letting yourself be emotionally charged by the guilt or by the resentment. And those are the very things we want to remove, not cultivate. Okay? Okay, tighten your seatbelts. Dr. Monica Lukesk in Constantine University in Frankfurt, Germany, studied 2,000 pregnant women through their pregnancy into the birth of the child. And she concluded that the mother's attitude during pregnancy, her attitude about the child, had the single greatest effect on the infant's personality, what caused the personality of the child. She showed that the attitude was actually more important for the happiness and the well-being of that child than physical needs. Now, the child needs physical needs. It has to have vitamins and nutrition, all those things that are needed for good prenatal care. The child needs to be properly nourished, and the mother should know how to eat well for the child. That's very important, but not as important as her own attitude about that child in her womb. Now, the studies, these 2,000 women all had the same economic background, so they had some kind of homogeneity in the study itself that gave a stability to the study. The children of these mothers showed some interesting facts. The ones whose mothers really accepted them and looked forward to the arrival of the baby and so on, these children were emotionally much healthier and physically healthier at birth than other children, and also after birth, and compared to the ones whose mothers did not totally accept them. Now, something similar to that was, working together and sort of overlapping this, was a study by Dr. Gerhard Rothman at the University of Salzburg in Austria. And he came to the same conclusions. He said he divided it down more into 4 categories. There's 4 types of pregnant women. Now, see if you know your mother in this listing, and you'll know something about yourself. And if you are a mother who's pregnant or has been or perhaps will be, you'll know something about your future or present children. Okay? The first is the ideal mother. The ideal mother, when they took the psychological testing, showed that they really wanted their unborn child intensely. They wanted that. They had the easiest pregnancies, the most trouble-free births, and the healthiest offspring, both physically and emotionally, when the mothers really intensely wanted those children. The second type is a catastrophic mother. The catastrophic mother are the ones that didn't want their children, but they wouldn't have an abortion or anything, but they just didn't want the children, and they had the most devastating medical problems during the pregnancy, the highest rate of premature babies. They had the lowest weight babies, and they had the babies that were most emotionally disturbed. A lot of crying and things like that. Those were the mothers who were the catastrophic mothers, who didn't really want those babies. Now, the third type is called the ambivalent mother, the one who is outwardly happy about the pregnancy, but has inner fears, financial problems, wondering if they're going to handle it, has some regrets. Maybe we got too many children, I can't handle it. But they really are outwardly happy, but inwardly have negative emotions of fears or regrets. And subconsciously, it's hard to get a handle on the subconscious mind, so you don't know what you're dealing with there, but subconsciously they actually rejected their child. If you tell them they reject it, they would deny it, because they say, no, I want the child. But subconsciously they were rejecting it. They wanted and didn't want it. There was an ambivalence there, okay? And these children in the womb have a spiritual sensor by which they can detect this when they're unwanted. And so these children were born with unusually large number of behavioral problems, and physically they had gastrointestinal problems. Their whole life, they had dyspepsia, they had indigestion, they had heartburn, they had all kinds of spastic colitis, and they had ulcers and stuff like that. Always within the gastrointestinal problems for the one who had the ambivalent mothers, who subconsciously, and the psychological testing showed this, subconsciously they didn't want the babies, consciously they did. By the way, the sensitivity of an unborn child is something unbelievable. Studies, again, I go back to Dr. Vernon in Toronto. A child that's about to be aborted is like a person in front of a firing squad. They know they're going to die. And they're sort of screaming, "Don't kill me, don't kill me. I don't want to die." They know they're going to die. They can find reactions even before the actual killing of the child in the womb. They find reactions there. The child's really already reacting. That's great sensitivity. These children also have an awareness of an argument going on between the husband and wife. They have an awareness when the mother is depressed. The child feels it. There's even a hormone change in the child in the womb when the mother is depressed. They have all these reactions. They're very sensitive. They're constantly resonating the mother's reaction, and indirectly, by the way, the father's reaction. They have a sense, even when there's a cold silence between the mother and the father, where they just don't communicate. The child picks that up, that cold silence. They know that somehow they just feel uncomfortable. They're not really in a comfortable situation. They relate to the father by this embryonic telepathy that we're learning more and more about in infant psychology these days. The final group, the fourth group of mothers, are called confused mothers. They're confused about their pregnancy. There's something like the ambivalent mothers, but not quite the same. They have consciously legitimate reasons for not wanting the child. They say, "We can't afford this child," or "I don't want the pain of childbirth." They have objective reasons by which they resist it, okay? But they really desire the baby. So here they have a desire for the baby and yet a desire against it. And they're kind of confused. They're afraid of the pain, they're afraid of the expense, and so on. The children born to these confused mothers that are pulled two directions at once regarding the pregnancy, these children turn out to have an unusual degree of apathy. They're very lethargic, physically lethargic and emotionally lethargic. They never turn out to be leaders. They're very blah personalities, very colorless personalities. They're sort of lost in the crowd someplace their whole life, and they sort of drift around, and their personality becomes very, very colorless, very apathetic, very blah. The mother's attitude can cause that to the child. Now, let's move into the relationship between the mother and the father during pregnancy. Again, Dr. Verney now. He says that the father's influence on the unborn child is almost as important as the mother's attitude. The quality of the woman's relationship with her husband, if they're unmarried, relationship with the partner, is decisive, a very decisive effect on the child. It's amazing how that child in the womb relates to the biological parents in an emotional telepathy. A very decisive effect on them. And I gave you this statistic, I think, this morning. I'm going to quote it again. That a child in a pregnancy within a stormy marriage, stormy relationship, runs a 237% greater risk of bearing psychologically or physically damaged child than a woman who is in a good, secure relationship. 237% increase of either some physical defect, birthmarks, or some kind of eye deformity, or some kind of teratogenetic effect, which is monster-producing effect, and extra fingers and things like that. They have a much higher percentage, as well as a psychological deformity, where they have this tendency toward depression, toward anxiety, toward neurotic conditioning, and things like that later in life. Now, I deal with this much more extensively in my book on Healing the Family Tree, because we go through the biological and also the adoptive relationships there and show how to heal those things through the Eucharist especially. That's another whole approach. This is healing of memories. That's healing a family tree. The book especially. We have 1,200 scripture citations or quotations in that book dealing with this issue of the transmitted effects from the parents. The exercise of love is can not only build up your health physically, it can also prevent the deterioration of your health. A very interesting study was done at Harvard University. They took a movie. You see that movie about Mother Teresa of Calcutta? I forget the name of it. I think it's just called Mother Teresa. I don't know. But anyway, it's about her life, and shows pictures of Mother Teresa dealing with the lepers and all those people, the homeless people there, and the people dying in the gutters of Calcutta. Now, they showed this to some of the students there at Harvard University, this movie. But before they went into the theater to see the movie, they took a test of their saliva, of the immunoglobulin E, immunoglobulin E. I know the immunoglobulin A, because there's a different Z. They just taste the A. They took the saliva and took the test of every single student that went in to see that movie, just before they went into the movie. Then they took another test of the saliva after the movie, where they saw all this compassion and love that they identified with. They were crying through the movie and seeing all that. They were going through this experience. And the difference was amazing, because the immunoglobulin A is a sign of the degree of immunity to disease. In the mouth, among other places, but up to the body, is part of the whole immune system. The immunoglobulin A was much higher after the movie than it was before, and there was only an hour's difference there. And every single person that watched that movie had an increase of immunity to disease. What happened in that movie? There was no physical, they didn't have to take physical medicine or anything. They didn't change their metabolism. They just changed their mind, turned on love. Love for the poor. And that caused that reaction in their body. I tell you, the body, there's no thought you can have that doesn't have some kind of resonating in the body. I took a course with some psychiatrists on the 5 forms of the biofeedback mechanism. And we had a woman psychiatrist, a psychoneuroimmunologist, wonderful woman doctor, who was teaching us this thing. We had all these machines there in this classroom. And I was allowed in there only because I've been teaching psychology. They didn't allow, lay people in there normally, just doctors and psychiatrists. And they said, now this this machine, we want to. One of the 5 forms of biofeedback is the GSR, the galvanic skin response. It's called. It says we're going to measure your body's effect of your mind. There was this big machine with a huge dial on it, with an indicator that swung from left to right, like a speedometer type of thing, And she said, could I have a volunteer? So one woman doctor said she'd volunteer, so she sat there. She says, now, you're sitting behind this machine. You can't see it. The class can see it. You can't see it. I'm hooking up this machine to you. She put the electrodes on the back of her hands to measure the uric acid in the ultramicroscopic droplets of perspiration. That's all it did. It measured the electric conductivity of the uric acid from the perspiration in the hydrometer. Okay? And this was hooked up to this big machine. And she says, now this is pointing to neutral right now, in the middle. And he says, now I want you to think of someone that you love very much. Just don't mention the word, don't do any speaking. Just think of someone you love and someone you feel very comfortable with, someone you admire, someone you feel warmth toward, someone you really like and love a lot. Or think of an episode of someone in the past who you loved and who treated you well or hugged you or whatever. Just think of that.